This video will explain how to create a solar system animation in 3ds Max. So what I've gone ahead to do is start up the modeling and the texturing for this project. So I have the sun and 9 planets, and then I also have a stars sphere. I have an asteroid shape over here as well, and then I also have a little spaceship. So we're going to create animation for everything but the stars. We're going to create rotate-based animation for the planets, and then also for the Earth's moon. And then we're going to create a translate animation for the asteroid. We're going to create a scale and a rotate animation for the sun to make it look like it's kind of pulsating. And then we're going to create what's called a path constraint animation for the spaceship, so it'll follow a path around the scene instead of us having to manually animate that. Okay, so I did want to take a second to briefly discuss how the materials are created. So I simply just Google searched planet textures, in particular like Earth texture, moon, things like that, and then just set up materials in the compact material editor, made sure the show realistic map button is turned on, so as you can see the textures in the viewport, and then applied them to all of the different planets. So a couple of particular ones are the rings for Saturn and then also Uranus. So those both have the same texture map, which is just invisible here, but what it is a texture map that looks similar to this, and then this is applied to the diffuse channel as well as the opacity channel, so it'll make it transparent as well. So something like this, that's a flat plane. It's two-sided on the materials turned on, so that from both angles you can see the texture. So all this was a cylinder that was dragged out, or really a tube, excuse me, that was dragged out, and then everything was deleted but the bottom face of it. Uranus's rings are the same, they're just scaled a little bit differently. Okay, another material that's a little bit different is the sun's material. So I have a basic sphere, and then what I did was I copied this sphere and then made noise to it, so you can see I have a noise modifier on that. I did this a couple times, and then actually have 3 different rays section. Each one of them has a slightly different noise around there. So the sun has one particular texture to it. See if I can roll over here to find that. So here's the sun's texture. And then I also have a rays texture, which is done the same way as the rings. So the rays texture looks like this, and it's tiled twice. And then this is also copied over to the opacity. So it'll give this kind of neat little variation, so it looks like it does have kind of sun rays to it. So especially when this is rendered out, it looks pretty neat. So then we can go back and add some other effects like glow to this as well. So I have the planets scaled so that they're not exactly to scale, but according to their size in relationship to the sun. I do have them scaled out, but so that we can still see them, so that like Mercury and Pluto aren't too small to where the animation is just no longer existing pretty much with the speed for it. So we're going to create a relative based animation and visual scale for everything. It's kind of another part for animation that's important, is to create animation that is visible, but is also that is exaggerated. So the scale for all the planets and the sun are exaggerated a little bit for the movement and even the rotation for it. Okay, so how do we start the rotation-based animation? Animation in 3ds Max and digital packages like 3ds Max are all based off of keyframe animation. So we have the timeline down here, we have the playback settings, and we have some key buttons down here. So the key buttons, we have the set key, and that's how we save the attribute for rotate, move, rotate, scale, whatever it's going to be. On that particular frame, we then move the frame, change the attribute, and click the key button again. Since we have everything created, we can turn on set key. So this is basically a mode. It allows us to be able to animate when we're in set key, but we don't want to do anything else. So like creating objects or editing materials or anything, we don't want to make any of those adjustments when we're in set key mode. So make sure set key or auto key is turned off when you're doing anything but animation. But when you're in animation mode, that means you're in set key. So turn on set key, it'll have a red bar that says, well, wait a minute, you're in set key mode. You should be only animating when you're in this mode. Okay, so what we're going to do is create a rotate animation for each one of our planets. I did also want to note I have set up some linking already. So the sun's rays are all linked with the select and link tool. If you click on the select and link and drag from that object to the parent object, which in this case would be the sun, when you move or even rotate that sun, everything else will move with it. So I've done the same thing for the Earth's moon. So you can see with the link tool, you can also just click and drag an object underneath another object, and that makes it a child of that object. So I also have some clouds that I'm going to come back and talk to or discuss here in a little bit as far as how to animate the clouds. The clouds are set up the same way as the solar flares and then also the rings for the two planets. So you can kind of see where the clouds are on top of that. So we're going to come back and talk about the clouds later, but we did go ahead and set up the linking like for the rings. This is a parent, or the Saturn planet is a parent to the rings. So you have to do just kind of click and drag this to different areas, and then it will parent that underneath that object. So when this object moves the planet, the rings will move or rotate with it. Okay, so back to animation. So what we're going to do is have each planet orbit or rotate around the sun. Now we can just move this around, but it's not going to create a very fluent animation. And in essence, planets don't orbit in a full circular fashion. They orbit in an elliptical fashion around the sun. But for this animation, we're going to have the planets do orbit around the sun in a circular fashion, just to make it simple. Okay, so what we need to do is to change the pivot point, because we're going to do a rotate animation. Right now the pivot point for each planet is around the center of that planet. We need it to rotate around the sun. Now if this was a motion where we also need to have the planet orbit around the sun and then revolve around its own axis, we would have to set up another hierarchy-based system. But this is going to be a very basic motion of the planets orbiting around the sun. So in order to do that, we need to move to the hierarchy tab and then choose Effect Pivot Only. And then once we do this, we need to use the Quick Align tool. The Quick Align tool, we can access it through the Align button up here, but there's a keyboard shortcut for that. It's Alt-A. So when after I click Effect Pivot Only for the planet, I want to choose Alt-A. Just hit the keyboard shortcut Alt-A, and then I want to click on the sun. So that's going to bring up my Align settings, and it's also going to move the pivot point from the planet over to the sun. I do want to make sure X, Y, and Z position are all checked, and then the current and target object have a pivot point selection. So that moves the pivot point for this planet. We need to get out of Effect Pivot Only now. That moves the pivot point for this planet to the sun, so I can orbit around the sun. So let's go ahead and do that for all of the other planets. Select the planet, Effect Pivot Only, Alt-A, and then click on the sun, and we can just click OK here. So let's go ahead and do that for all the rest of these. Alt-A, and then the sun. I'm just going to continue to do that here. Now I'm going to come back and talk about the moon and how the moon is set up a little differently. But all of the planets need to have their pivot points aligned to the sun. Last one is Pluto. Here we go. Okay, so when we turn Effect Pivot Only off, every planet should orbit around the sun. So it makes the rotate or orbit animation pretty nice, pretty easy to manage. So what about the moon here? The moon needs to orbit around the Earth, not the sun. So let's select the moon. Let's click Effect Pivot Only and hit Alt-A, then click on the Earth. Well, what it actually does is move the pivot point to the sun, because the target object's set to pivot. I want to change this target object to center now. So the current object's pivot, the target object is center. The moon is the only one we have to adjust for it, because the Earth's pivot is now on the sun. So I want to change the target for when I'm aligning the moon's pivot to the center of the Earth. There we go. So now that's the only one I have to change. When I rotate the moon, it rotates around the Earth. But when I rotate the Earth, considering the moon is already a child of the Earth, both of them will orbit around the sun. So everything should be set up nicely. So if you need to review that part, just skip back earlier in this video to kind of review how to adjust the pivot points for all the planets. Okay, so now we can start animating. So let's go back to frame 0. And what I'm going to do is change my timeline. There's a couple different ways to do that, but there's a time configuration button. And if I click this, I'm going to change my end time to, let's just do 360, just make it easy here. And we can start with the first planet, but actually is a pretty easier method to start with the last planet, so Pluto. So I'm going to stick with the original idea of the planet, so I have 9 planets from Mercury to Pluto. So what I'm going to do is turn on set key. We're going to first start with the rotate animation, and I'm going to roll through creating keyframes for each planet orbiting around the sun. So in 360 frames, Pluto is going to orbit around once, and then all of the other planets will at least orbit around the sun once within the same time frame. Okay, so I'm going to start with Pluto, and I'm going to set the keyframe. So frame 0, and I'm going to go click on the big key button, set key. The keyboard shortcut for that is K. Okay, so on frame 0, it creates a vertical keyframe there, red, green, and blue. So I'm going to move the frame 360. And then what I'm going to do is make sure my angle snap is on, and I'm going to rotate this planet all the way around until it says 360. So there it says 360, closer to the sun. Now I'm going to click the key button again. So now I can hit the play button over here, and then now you can see over 360 frames, Pluto is going to revolve around the sun once. Okay. So after we have one planet going, we can do a little bit of math. We can also eyeball it, but what I've done here is done a little bit of math as far as within 360 frames, I want to make sure all of the planets revolve around and loop back to this starting point here. So my document is just pretty simple. I just have the 9 planets, and I have the increments of what I can put keyframes on. So here's Pluto. We've already done Pluto. And I have increments, revolutions, and total degrees. So Pluto will do 1 revolution in 360 frames. So that's also 360 degrees. So I can do increments of that with just some simple math. So Neptune, for 360 degree frames, I can do a keyframe every 180 frames. So that's divided by 2. So that's 2 revolutions. My total degrees would be 720. So I can put this simple little document in the notes of the video here, but I can also go all the way back up to Mercury, so you can kind of follow this if you'd like to. It's not necessary, but this way all of the animation for the planets would all go back to the same starting point, which is nice, so that we have a looping animation. So Mercury will have a keyframe on every 30 frames, which means that will go around the sun 12 times in the same amount of time that Pluto's going around the sun 1 time. So total degrees for Mercury is going to be 4,320 frames. So we can use this as kind of a basis for how we're going to set up the animation. So over 360 degree frames, Pluto goes around once. Over that same amount of time, we want the next planet to go around twice. So let's go to frame 0 and have Neptune selected, and we'll click on the key button. We're going to move to frame 360. So there's really 2 ways to do this. I can move to frame 180 and rotate this around 360 degrees. Click the key button. So within that same time, it moves around 360 degrees within 180 frames. And then I can move to a 360 frame and then rotate it around another 360 degrees. So that is it'll essentially do the same thing. So now when I hit play, Neptune will go around faster because it's going to go around the sun twice the same amount of time Pluto goes around the sun once. Okay, so but what I can do is I can now just delete this keyframe in the middle, because that's going to keep the motion. It's going to go around the sun 2 times, which is 720 frames or degrees, excuse me. So 720 degrees is what I can input into from frame 0 to 360. So now let's move up to Uranus. So over the same time frame, it's going to revolve 3 times. So I need to input 1080. That's 3 revolutions. So let's go to Uranus. Frame 0, set the key. I'll move to frame 360. And I'm just going to watch this number that's going to pop up above the sun as I'm rotating. I want to hit 1080. So there's 360, 720. Keep rolling around until you see 1080. There we go. So that's 3 revolutions. So let's click the key button. Let's zoom out a little bit and let's watch this. So each planet closer to the sun is going to revolve around the sun more times. 1, 2, And as it catches back up with the rest of them, 3. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this for the rest of the planets. I'm just going to keep inputting in these numbers. Next one will be 1440 for Saturn, and then so forth up. So this part will be sped up a little bit. Then we'll come back and kind of talk about this. Okay, so when we play back the motion, we have all the planets that are orbiting around. So Mercury is actually orbiting around 12 times, if you go back to our little graph or chart here. And then the rest of the planets are orbiting around less and less, but it's increments, so that way they will all still kind of line back up. So let's hit play here. So you can see everything is orbiting around, and as it gets back to frame 360, it all lines back up. It's kind of a nice way to do things with some simple math. Okay, let's talk about some of the specifics here before we move on to other types of animation. Okay, so what about the Earth's moon? So the Earth's moon is kind of hard to follow, but if you watch that moon, it just kind of follows in front of the Earth. So like the Earth is trying to play catch up to the moon. Well, what we can do is create a rotate animation for the moon that's going in the opposite way. So the Earth is going in counterclockwise, so we can do a motion for the moon going in clockwise. So maybe we're coming up and using the same number for Mercury, 4320, and we're going to add that rotate for the moon going the opposite direction. So let's click the key button on frame 0. We're going to move to frame 360, and let's do 4320 in the clockwise direction. But it's going to be negative 4320. So we're going to create a keyframe there. So now the motion is really going to be different. The moon is going to look like it is orbiting around the sun, the Earth. The Earth is going to look like it's orbiting around the sun. Okay, so that's a simple way to create planets orbiting around. Let's talk about other types of animation. So that's our rotate animation. So the scale animation is just simply going to be the sun just kind of pulsating up and down. So it's kind of an exaggeration-based animation, but every certain frames we're going to have the sun pulsating up. So let's go create a keyframe on frame 0, and then maybe every 30 frames it's going to pulsate up just a little bit, and then it's going to pulsate back down to frame 60. So within the timeline, what I can do is grab that frame on frame 0, which is the keyframe. I can copy a frame just as I copy an object. So if I hold down Shift and drag this keyframe over to frame 60, that will duplicate that frame. So frame 0 is now the same thing on frame 60. So within those 2 seconds, hit the play button, it's going to scale up and scale back down. So then all I need to do is drag select on a couple of the frames. So let's drag select on frame 30. Let's move that to frame 90. Let's make sure we're on the right frame here. So there's 90. There we go. So every 30 frames, we're going to copy the animation over. So now I can just copy all 4 of these. Actually, let's do 3. And that way I will continue it on to frame 120. We'll find frame 210 and copy this over again. So I'm just copying this motion over until I get to, see, what was that, frame 270, so 300. And this will be the last time I'm copying these over, and that'll get me right back to 360. So I'm just copying the frames over so that over the entire animation you can see it pulsating. I might be off actually. Let's go back, see, up and down. Whoop, maybe I stopped. So up, up. Okay, so we'll come back and we'll fix this. So I'll stop the video for a second and fix this. But basically every other frame, or every other time we're creating a keyframe, it's either going to be smaller or larger. So larger, smaller, larger. So let's just copy over, actually instead of the third one, it should be the 4th one. So let's do that. There we go. So that should be set up right now. So it'll loop properly, but it's also scaling. Okay, so it's not exaggeration-based animation, but it's kind of something interesting that we can add that breaks up the space. Okay, so I do have a little asteroid up here with a neat little texture and variation on it. So this is going to be just my move animation. So I'm going to get my move tool, and I've already set up my, hit Z to zoom, I've already set up my coordinate system. So from view, if you see the axis change, I want to change this from view to local. So that way one axis always follows that angle. So I've rotated this object, and then when I change the axis to local, it allows me to be able to animate in that angle. So let's change that back to local. Got changed accidentally. Okay, so over this same timeline, 0 to 360, I'm going to click a keyframe button on 0 for this asteroid. I'm going to move to frame 360, and I'm just going to move it through the scene here. So just drag it all the way down. So this way the motion will kind of follow the angle that the asteroid is running. Okay, so if I drag back and kind of watch that motion, this is just a move animation. So that's all it is. Over 360 degree frames, it's going to move from one place to another place. Same idea, set the keyframe between two different frames while you're changing the attributes. So we have a rotate animation, we have a scale animation for the sun, and then we have a move animation for the meteor or asteroid. So last type of animation we're going to do is called a path constraint animation. For this we need to turn off the set key because we're going to create a path, which is a spline. So the spaceship is going to follow a spline throughout the scene, and we need to create that spline so the spline can look however you'd like it to be. So I'm just going to click and drag out. Whoops, actually what I want to do first is change the initial type and drag type to smooth for both of them. So that way when I drag, it's going to create a smooth blend for me. So maybe we get closer to some of the planets. There we go. And I'm going to choose close spline here because I want it to be a full looping cycle. Okay, there we go. So I can also vary this a little bit. Let's go to vertex mode. Let's move some of these points down. Let's move some of these points up. So that way in the third axis it actually looks more natural. Everything isn't just sitting there on the same flat axis. There we go. That looks pretty good. Okay, let's name this spacecraft path. Why not? There we go. Okay, so I have this little spacecraft over here, and I have a sub-object that is actually parented underneath that, which is the little trail that's going to follow it. So what I want to do is I want to go up to the animation menu with this spacecraft selected. I want to go to Constraints, and then I'm going to choose Path Constraint. So this allows me to have a dotted line, and it says we need to choose a path. So Animation Constraints Path Constraint, and then click on the path. Now that's going to go ahead and move the object onto the path according to whatever frame you're on. So let's play this. So remember I did this with set key turned off, but if you see that spaceship, it's now following across the path now. And it will loop all the way back to the initial position. So basically with the creation of the path, wherever you first click to start the line or spline, that's the starting point for the animation, and wherever you lastly click, that's the ending point for the animation. And then whatever your timeline is set at when you create that path constraint, that's how long it's going to take for that object to follow from the start and end point of that curve. So it actually does create a keyframe of frame 0 and 360. But there's one kind of weird thing about this. So let's go scroll back to frame 0, is that the spaceship is not actually following the path. It actually is on there, but it's not facing the right direction. So there's a couple different ways I can do this. I can simply go, and as you're creating a path constraint, it goes ahead and moves you to the motion tab of the command panel. And down the bottom, here's the path deformation or constraint. And what I'm going to do is just turn on follow. So that should do a pretty good job. I can also turn on bank. What follow does is it should follow the path a little better. And then bank, actually, when I'm in a corner, is going to bank the plane or this object, a spaceship, to the inside of that curve. So those two things will help, but I also need to come in here with my rotate tool And let's see, let's go change the coordinate system back to local here, and let's rotate that so it follows the path. So I'm going to rotate this down just a little bit. There we go. So you might need to rotate it with local coordinate system, and then also turn on follow and bank. So now when I hit play, it is going to follow that path correctly. Get an angle where you can see that coming in. So I can also turn up that bank amount, which in curves it'll bank it more. You can kind of see it bank more or less, so maybe like 1 degree. So it's like an airplane and the air is turning into the curves. There we go. So that's the path constraint. So now we have a pretty interesting animation going on. What we can do is select this path, and we can just hide this path for right now. So hide selection. If I right click and choose hide selection, so now the spaceship will still follow the path, but the path has disappeared. So we've got 4 different types of animation here. We have the rotate or orbit animation, changing the pivot point to the center of the sun for each planet. We've used the increments with mathematics to be able to have them all loop back to the same point. We have a scale animation for the sun. It'll kind of pulse in and out. We have a move animation for the asteroid, so it'll move throughout the scene. And then we have a path constraint animation for our spacecraft. Now we would want to make sure that throughout the animation the actual spacecraft does not go through any of the planets. So it looks like it's pretty close there, but that's pretty good. And if it does, what you can do is just move the points on the actual trail, or that's a trail, excuse me, the spacecraft path. So let's unhide this. Unhide by name, and choose spacecraft. There we go. So if this is an issue, all you have to do is just go to the vertex, find the plane or spacecraft, and it'll auto adjust where that plane follows. So if something is in the way, you can move the vertex for the spline around, and the animation will follow as well. Okay, so one last thing I want to talk about was the Earth's clouds. So let's go select the Earth. So I have the Earth's clouds, and they do have an opacity map on them as well, just like the other objects do. So here's my Earth's clouds. They have this texture map, and this is also applied to the opacity channel here. Same channel, or same object or texture applied to the opacity channel, so that the black areas will be transparent. So with it's not selected, you can kind of see where the clouds are going to be. So it's just a different sphere with a different texture on the top of it. So since it's parented underneath the Earth, what I can do is create maybe the same similar animation as what I have for the moon. Let's turn set key on and click the key button, and this will rotate in clockwise instead of counterclockwise. So over 360 frames. Maybe that's a slow animation, so maybe we're going to do 720. I can find 720. There we go. And click the key button. So over that same time, the clouds are going to slowly revolve around the Earth. Now this is going to be a little difficult to kind of follow, but they will move around, which is kind of neat. See them moving around a little bit, that are differently orbiting or rotating versus what the Earth is doing. So now we can create some pretty cool animations with move, rotate, scale, and then even think about a path constraint animation. Alright, so that'll wrap up this video on animating the solar system.